Hey everyone, it's Nancy Miller, the host of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. And what you are about to hear is the debut episode of the brand new subscriber offering called Dead Sleep Naked. I created Dead Sleep Naked as a special version of the podcast that's just 100% pure narration. Just my voice, with no music or sound effects. Dead Sleep Naked is custom made for anyone who is sensitive to background noise, is hard of hearing, or just prefers to enjoy their dead sleep au naturel. So what you're about to hear is the first of 7 episodes. Those are existing dead sleep stories that we've remastered to work as standalones with quality narration, no audio extras. Dead Sleep Naked is included in your $5 subscription and will be rolled out this month. That's May. Available on Patreon, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify in the coming weeks. And thanks to everyone for the great feedback and this brilliant idea. This free episode is from a story that we published back in November of 2024. It's called If Anything Ever Happens to Me. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining me. I'm Nancy Miller, and this is Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. If you're new to the podcast, Dead Sleep is made for people who love to fall asleep to true crime and want a real-life mystery told more mindfully. Dead Sleep is listener-supported and ad-free. You can subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Patreon. Links are in the show notes. And since there are no obnoxious pre-programmed ads, you can take a deep breath, settle in for the night, get cozy under those covers as we dig into tonight's episode, a continuation into the archive of the truest of true crime icons, Ann Rule. In the previous episode, we revisited Ann Rule's story. How, at around the age of 40, the struggling true crime writer struck up a friendship with a college student that she volunteered with, a man she liked named Ted Bundy. She had no idea that her friendship with Ted Bundy would launch her career when it was revealed that her buddy Bundy was a serial killer. The result was her first book, and it was huge, called The Stranger Beside Me. And in the previous episode, we covered a few of her biggest books, but we also told the story of one of my favorites called Dead by Sunset. And that book, Dead by Sunset, you'll hear a little bit more about it tonight. It was first published in 1995 and made into a TV miniseries. And that book and the murder behind it, the real story, plays a strange and eerie role in what happens to the woman at the center of this episode. Just to note that, as always, there is no graphic violence in Dead Sleep. And I want to also note that Every Breath You Take, which is the book that this is drawn from, is close to 900 pages. It's over 20 hours of an audiobook. And I've done my best to distill down to a little bouillon cube the essence of this story. But as always, this is the Dead Sleep interpretation with these little detours that we go into to fatigue your mind, to give you a night's sleep. But I always encourage you to read the source material if you want more of the story. About a woman who predicted her own murder and who needed Ann Rule's help to investigate and reveal what really happened. And you'll hear all about it in tonight's episode that I'm calling If Anything Ever Happens to Me. Our story begins on a cozy evening inside watching TV on the couch. November 9th, 1995. A 33-year-old woman named Sheila picked up the phone and called her younger sister, Carrie. Sheila said to Carrie, "Turn on your TV. There's a movie you need to watch." Now, the sisters were thousands of miles apart. Sheila was in Texas and Carrie in Oregon. But Carrie managed to find the same channel, Lifetime for Women, and that network had a juicy crime drama based on true events. It was called Dead by Sunset. Dead by Sunset was a miniseries about a self-centered, devious, violent, narcissistic husband who lies and cheats everyone he knows. It was based on a real story, a book by Ann Rule that you heard a lot about in the previous episode. You'll remember that guy's name was Brad Cunningham. And in this TV version of that book, Brad was played by an actor named Ken Olin, who was basically, the basic cable version of John Hamm in the 90s. Brad Cunningham's whole deal was seducing and controlling women. He was a serial baby collector. He would meet a woman, get her pregnant as fast as possible, and then once he was done with her, he'd divorce her and discard her. But he would maintain control over her for years in long and drawn-out custody battles over those children. The children he sired, but never really wanted. They were just a method to torment the women that he liked to torture and drain each of these women's bank accounts. He'd leave them with nothing except fear. And as Sheila and Carrie watched in this TV movie, Brad, one day, took the ultimate fateful step, and he killed his wife, his fourth wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, named Cheryl Keaton, striking her over the head with a tire iron. On that show and in real life, Brad tried to stage her death as an accident. He almost got away with it, too. And thanks to Ann Rule and her dogged reporting, she told the whole dark and fascinating story and transformed a tragic saga into a gripping bestseller. Back on the phone, the sisters chatted about what they were seeing on screen. And Sheila said to Carrie, "This guy, Brad Cunningham, that killer, did he remind Carrie of anyone?" Of course he did. The charming and conniving psychopath wielding a tire iron on screen? They couldn't help but notice. It reminded both of them of Sheila's ex-husband, Alan. Carrie and Sheila watched the show together, marveling over the similarities between these two dangerous men with a disquieting fascination. Just like this bad guy on screen, Sheila's ex lived to manipulate and control everyone, using women and then disposing of them afterwards. Thankfully, Sheila escaped from that marriage alive, unlike this poor woman, Cheryl, on screen. But even though they'd been divorced for several years, Sheila was still afraid of Alan. When Sheila ended her marriage, she told her sister, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me that you will see there is an investigation." And now, all these years later, in 1995, she reminded her sister Carrie of that promise. As they watched Dead by Sunset, she said, "Remember what I told you about what to do if anything happened to me?" Carrie said she did. Then Sheila said, "Now promise me one more thing, that if I'm not here, you will find Ann Rule and have her write my story." Sheila said this half in jest, but for Carrie, it was serious. For years, all during Sheila's marriage to Alan, Carrie was afraid something was going to happen to her sister. Every time the phone rang, that it would be Sheila crying helpless to stop her abusive husband. Or worse, it would be the police, telling her they had bad news. The worst kind of news. But now, in 1995, Sheila had made a fresh start. She didn't really need to be afraid of Alan anymore, did she? They both hoped that Sheila was just being paranoid. Maybe she'd watched too many of those campy Lifetime true crime dramas about naive women who fall prey to terrible men. That unnerving blur of real-life tragedy and on-screen entertainment, that sometimes it was hard to know what was real and what wasn't. Still, Sheila couldn't shake this fear, this premonition that Alan wasn't finished with her. That even though things were going well right now, her ex-husband Alan was always there, somewhere, lurking, watching, waiting in the wings for that perfect moment to destroy her. He was going to kill her, and that he'd likely get away with it. He got away with everything. Carrie was 7 years younger than Sheila, and she'd looked up to Sheila her whole life. And Carrie remembered when Sheila first met Alan, all the way back in 1982, when Carrie was around 12 and Sheila was 18 and fresh out of high school. Sheila worked as a receptionist at a prominent law firm in Salem, Oregon. Carrie remembered Sheila coming home from work and saying that the law firm, it was busy, but mostly the work was boring. Lawyer stuff, divorces, bankruptcies, financial disputes. But one day, Sheila came home and told Carrie about someone who came into that law firm. A young man strode into the waiting room. He was intense-looking, tall, built like the pro football player he once was. But something about him, Sheila later said, it made her skin crawl. Sheila was petite, barely 5 feet tall and 100 pounds, a pretty blonde who might have seemed delicate because of her looks, but Sheila was known among her family as a strong-willed woman and a shrewd judge of character. And this dude gave Sheila the creeps. Sheila soon learned that this shady-looking guy, his name was Randy Woodfield. Randy Woodfield. She and Carrie and everyone in Oregon and California and all over America knew this man's name. Randy Woodfield was better known as the I-5 killer, a serial killer believed to be behind the murders of at least 18 people, possibly up to 44 according to authorities. He was known as the I-5 killer or the I-5 bandit because he traveled up and down Interstate Highway 5, a murderous crime spree that spanned 3 states along the Pacific West Coast: Oregon, Washington, and California. The law firm where Sheila worked, they were defending Randy Woodfield. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful, and the I-5 killer was found guilty of murder, attempted murder, among other felony charges that ensured he'd be in prison for the rest of his life. Just days after Sheila had that creepy encounter with Randy, she told Carrie about another young man who came into the law firm. And this man was a different story. His name was Alan Van Hoot. He was 27 years old and the proverbial tall, dark, and handsome stranger, like something out of a romance novel crossed with a GQ model. Alan was impeccably dressed in a suit. and he appeared to be successful enough to hire this expensive law firm to handle his divorce. Sheila assumed he was getting divorced from his first wife. Sheila didn't know that this was actually his second divorce, that he'd been married twice to two different women, and he wasn't even 30 yet. But maybe it wouldn't have mattered. Sheila was dazzled by Alan. Because Sheila loved glamour, the kind of sophisticated glam you didn't see much of in rural Oregon, where she was from. And at 18, she had opposing desires. For her, like many women at that time, even now, it felt like there were two doors. Door number one, Sheila saw herself going to college, working hard and enjoying a busy and fulfilling career. Door number two, Sheila saw herself getting married to a wonderful and successful man and enjoying a life as a perky, perfect stay-at-home wife and mother. That she'd have a showplace of a home, dinner parties, and travel all over the world with her generous and successful, high-powered husband. The day she met Alan and they locked eyes, she felt immediately drawn to him. On their first date, Alan took Sheila to an exclusive nightclub in Salem. And it seemed everywhere they went, everybody knew Alan. He just dropped his name, and they got the VIP treatment. Alan was a local business owner. He owned a stereo store, with plans, he said, to build his business into an empire. Now, this was the late 70s and early 80s, when a home stereo system was more important than a TV. The best kind of turntables had a needle cut from a diamond, plus tall tower speakers that offered this innovative type of technology called quadraphonic sound. These systems could cost thousands of dollars. Someone like Alan, who owned a specialty high-end stereo store, could stand to make a fortune. Unfortunately, Alan said that his recent divorce had led him to declare bankruptcy. His ex-wife, Mary, she took him to the cleaners. But he said he was back on track, and with the way business was going, things were only going to go up. Sheila was only 18 years old, but she knew she was in love. By their third date, Sheila knew she wanted to marry Alan. And her parents, who were middle-class folks from a small Oregon town, they were dazzled by Alan too. He told them he'd served in the military and graduated with an engineering degree from Stanford University. So her parents gave the couple their blessing. Because of his divorce, Alan said he needed a place to live. So he moved in with Sheila and her parents, and her little sister Carrie, who was still a preteen. Alan made sexually suggestive comments that creeped Carrie out. But she kept them to herself. And by 19, Sheila was married. By 20, she was pregnant with their first child. And by 23, Sheila was a young wife and mother of two girls. She'd chosen door number 2. But she had to admit, it just happened so fast. Sheila was 18 when she met Alan. She had no idea what was really behind door number 2, that when she walked through that door, it would slam shut behind her. And Alan, the man she'd married, he wasn't the charming, successful, witty Mr. Perfect she believed him to be. He hadn't been in the military. He wasn't some Stanford engineering genius, but a pathological liar and con artist, obsessed with two things: power and, of course, money. Alan monitored every move Sheila made. Meanwhile, he carried on as he pleased, with a willful disregard of the consequences. Within their first year of marriage, while living under the roof of Sheila's parents, Alan scammed Sheila's parents out of their retirement money, persuading the couple to invest in his stereo equipment franchise, one that went belly up. And when Oregon authorities were after him for all of his defrauding and flim-flamming of banks, he fled to Hawaii, insisting Sheila go with him. Sheila was deeply religious, and Alan knew how to use her Christian faith to his advantage. Alan also grew up in a religious household, and he liked to quote the Bible. And when she hesitated about leaving with him, that she wanted to stay in Oregon and be with her parents, he reminded her that in the Bible, it said that when you marry, you must leave your parents and cleave unto your husband. You know that is your Christian duty, he told her. Alan didn't feel that same sense of duty. Not only did he cheat on her with other women, he had some sexual proclivities that he didn't reveal until after they were married. And it's when they moved away from Sheila's parents, Alan let his freak flag fly. He liked to dress up in women's clothes, drive the streets of their town, find the youngest male prostitutes that he could, bring them back to their house, and engage in a series of sadomasochistic rituals, the boys flogging Alan while he made Sheila watch. Sheila was innocent, had never seen anything like this stuff before, and what's more, she felt like it was performative, that Alan did it just to humiliate and demean her. And it worked. Humiliation and despair is what Alan knew. He never really liked to talk about his past, not with Sheila. And the truth was, he didn't really have a mother or father. Alan's father left not long after Alan was born. And his mother, who'd had Alan when she was just 16 years old, she'd like to remind him he'd ruined her life, and she'd wish that he'd never been born. And within a few years of marriage, Alan ruined Sheila's life. He was physically violent and a master manipulator who managed to fool everyone into thinking he was an incredible guy. And he always seemed to get away with things that no one else could get away with. Whether it was scamming a bank or physically and mentally abusing Sheila, he never seemed to get the punishment that he deserved. On more than one occasion, Sheila called the police because she was afraid of Alan. And there was a time where he took things so far, he was arrested. Ultimately, he found a way to get out of it. Barely got probation. So things never changed. Because of everything that had happened between Alan and Sheila's parents, they weren't on speaking terms anymore. So her only family that she talked to regularly was her little sister, Carrie. When this marriage was going on in the 80s, Carrie was just a teenager. She was in high school. And Carrie, constantly worried about what might happen, finally, after moving from Oregon to Hawaii to Texas, Sheila confided to Carrie that she was going to ask Alan for a divorce. It was 1987, and they'd been married for 3 years. She was afraid to leave because it was a no-win situation. Sheila knew if she stayed, he'd kill her. If she left, he'd kill her. But at least, by leaving, she had a fighting chance, and she'd maybe be able to keep her girls safe. In Alan's past divorces, he didn't seem to dwell on them, and he moved on quickly. And that's because in each case, he had something better. Another woman waiting in the wings. But this time, Alan didn't have anyone else teed up. So when Sheila asked for a divorce, he wasn't ready to let her go. Plus, Alan and Sheila and their 2 children were living in San Antonio, Texas. Texas laws wouldn't require Alan to pay alimony necessarily, but he would have to pay child support. Alan was generous with himself, but tight-fisted with everyone else. And the last thing he wanted was to have to write a check each month for those children. They were part of a long con. From the day they were born, they were assets, not kids. Alan insisted his 2 daughters be named Stevie and Daryl. At the time, he said it was because he was a fan of singer Stevie Nicks and 80s movie star Daryl Hannah. But in truth, Sheila would learn that he gave them boys' names so he could later steal their social security numbers, get credit cards in their names, and pass those credit cards and social security numbers off as his own. He'd pretend he was Stevie or Daryl. Sheila realized how naive she was when she met Alan. Again, she was 18. But it took her a few years to understand why his 2 previous wives had left him as quickly as they'd married him and vanished, never to be seen again. And if she hadn't gotten pregnant so fast, maybe she could have escaped sooner. She loved her 2 girls, but Sheila was so afraid of having to raise another child with her sadistic and cruel husband, she secretly went and got her tubes tied. A surgical procedure that ensured she couldn't get pregnant, no matter what. At long last, on September 22nd, 1988, Sheila got her divorce and was granted primary custody of Daryl and Stevie, which meant Alan was still in her life, but it was solely as the girls' father, and she'd only have to see him when he came to get the girls on weekends. Over time, Sheila assumed that Alan would move on. She knew his emotions were like a light switch, that he could easily turn off and on his feelings with a click. One day he loved her, one day he hated her, one day she hoped that switch would click and he'd be indifferent towards her, as he was with so many other people. But for Alan, control was his drug, and he enjoyed watching Sheila struggle. In the divorce, she didn't get much. She couldn't afford a lawyer, so she had some lawyers where she worked help her, but overall she had to negotiate the divorce herself. And she ended up with some furniture, some odds and ends. She didn't want anything for herself, just child support and health insurance for her little girls. She and Stevie and Daryl ended up in a very modest 2-bedroom apartment in a complex, one that seemed to have a lot of other recent divorcees. And Sheila learned her experience with a dangerous and controlling man was far too common. And she'd one day consider herself lucky. Sheila had a next-door neighbor named Sue. Sue was a woman around Sheila's age who had gone through a brutal divorce herself. Sue's husband was a very wealthy dentist with a successful practice, though with Sue, he was cheap. She barely scraped by. And in truth, she knew he was a mentally deranged abuser, and he threatened to kill her a number of times. While Sue was neighbors with Sheila, she had actually met a guy named Carl, and he was great, and they planned to get married. There was just one more thing Sue had to do. One more item she had to retrieve. And then the marriage was over. And she could start over again with Carl. Her ex-husband still had family photos, baby pictures of their kids that Sue really wanted. Sue made sure never to be alone with her estranged husband. But one day, he lured her into his dental office with the promise of those baby photos. She thought she'd be safe because it was his office, a public space with patients and the dental assistants who worked there. But when she arrived, she noticed no one else was there. What she didn't notice, until it was too late, was the claw hammer her ex-husband had in his hand as he lunged toward her in a deadly fury. Afterwards, the husband tried to stage the scene. He placed a bread knife somewhere obvious and claimed Sue had come to the dental office to kill him. But it took about 8 seconds for the cops to know the truth. He killed her. And the claw hammer they found, with his fingerprints and her blood on it, would go a long way ensuring a jury would find him guilty of murdering Sue. He spent the rest of his life in prison. Sue's fiancé was devastated, and in a strange twist of fate, Sue's fiancé, Carl, and her killer, her ex-husband, the dentist, would cross paths. Years after the murder, Carl ended up working as a prison guard at the nearby penitentiary. And one day, he discovered on his block was Sue's ex-husband, the man who killed the woman he loved. He asked to be transferred because he knew that if he had to look at that man for another day, Carl would end up behind those prison bars, and that dentist would end up dead. By 1995, when Sheila and Carrie were on the phone watching Dead by Sunset, things had changed a lot in the lives of both Sheila and Alan. For Alan, it was a literal name change. Alan Van Hoot was now Alan Blackthorne. Blackthorne was the name of a complex and heroic character in Alan's favorite book and miniseries, Shogun. And he needed this new identity to forge this new life. The life of a multi-millionaire. Somehow, Alan experienced a stunning reversal of fortune, and one of his business schemes actually became legitimate, and it made Alan filthy rich. Within 10 years, Alan had gone from bankrupt hustler to man of leisure. He lived in a big mansion in the most expensive and exclusive area of San Antonio, Texas. He could do whatever he wanted. Play golf, gamble, and get married again. In 1993, Alan married an heiress named Maureen. And before they got married, Sheila actually tried to meet with Maureen, have a coffee with her, and warn her about who Alan really was. She'd wished that someone had done that to her. If only she'd met Alan's past ex-wives, maybe she would have thought twice. Maybe not. Maureen, like Sheila, was so wrapped up in Alan, she didn't want to hear anything bad about him. And she dismissed Sheila as a bitter ex-wife. So Alan and Maureen got married, and soon he had 2 more children. Sheila hoped this meant he'd move on. Her life had also changed dramatically. Around the same time that Alan remarried, Sheila married a burly ex-Marine turned pharmaceutical salesman named Jamie Bellish. She was now Sheila Bellish. The couple were so happy, they decided they wanted to start a family. Sheila untied her tubes, and the couple started their first round of in vitro fertilization. They were lucky. Sheila got pregnant on that first round. She and Jamie would be blessed with not 1, not 2, but 4 babies. She gave birth to 4 healthy quadruplets. In and around San Antonio, this made big news. Sheila and her 4 babies were famous. She became known as the Quad Mom. They were one big happy family. Sheila and Jamie and the Quads, along with her 2 daughters, Stevie and Daryl. They all moved into a nice house. Not a mansion like Alan's, but Sheila was going to make this place their dream home. Things weren't perfect, but with a new husband and her babies, she finally had everything she wanted. And she was happy. The end. No, but it wasn't the end. Somewhere in Alan's hilltop mansion, he was just getting started. He happened to catch at least one of the many news stories about his ex-wife Sheila, now a celebrity quad mom, and on TV and in the newspaper, Sheila and her husband beamed with pride over her babies. Sheila looked so happy, and Alan couldn't stand it. Look at her proud face, beaming for the camera, happy with everything she achieved. Alan hated her more than ever. This was far from over. Sheila was now a busy mom, and she didn't have time or the desire to spend her days thinking about Alan. Alan had nothing but time to think about Sheila. He was barely 40, and he'd never have to work again. His business generated roughly $30,000 a month. That's over $60,000 in today's dollars in passive income. He was married, 2 kids, lived in the biggest house, belonged to the swankiest country club, and yet, with everything he had, it wasn't enough. Because he couldn't stand Sheila out there in the world being happy. So he devised new ways to exert control over her life, just so she knew no matter what she did, who she married, where they lived, he was always going to be there. Alan Blackthorne, the thorn in her side. They divorced in 1988, and yet, throughout the mid-90s, Alan found ways to haul Sheila into court. In a constant battle over Stevie and Daryl, their 2 daughters, who'd grown into a pair of very confused, extremely angry adolescents. Stevie and Daryl, once close, were also at odds. Stevie, the older girl, didn't want anything to do with her father. Daryl, the younger one, was desperate for his attention. Alan played the sisters and their mother off of each other for maximum chaos. Alan was so dedicated to making Sheila miserable, he craftily inserted himself into the lives of her neighbors next door. He befriended a nosy older couple and turned them into his personal spies, ensuring they kept an eye on Sheila, her husband, and their kids, and then report back to Alan with their observations. He told the neighbors that he was convinced that Jamie and Sheila were abusing the children, and he needed them to document everything so he could take it to court and save these kids' lives. Over time, Sheila and her husband could see their neighbors, feel their eyes upon them, their judgment, and she could see one of the neighbors writing what Sheila said or did down in a little notebook for Alan. More than once, the neighbors called the police on Sheila and her husband Jamie and accused them of child abuse. And it didn't help that Daryl was aligned with her father and telling the neighbors lies about what Sheila and Jamie were doing. So they were in and out of court until, out of nowhere, Alan dramatically, impulsively decided to just let Sheila have their daughters. He was done. Sheila wondered, was this really it? If he let Sheila have their daughters, he wouldn't be in the picture anymore. They could move out of Texas. Sheila and Jamie decided they were done with San Antonio. Time for a fresh start. So in September of 1997, they relocated to Sarasota, Florida. Jamie kept his job as a pharmaceutical sales rep. Sheila could finally focus on her family. Her 4 babies were now toddlers, and she had to keep an eye on them constantly. Stevie, the oldest, was 13 and looking forward to a new life in a new school. Daryl, the younger one, didn't fare so well. Sheila believed Alan had brainwashed Daryl and turned her against the family. So when they all moved to Sarasota, Florida, Daryl, who was just 11, was sent to the Young Women's Christian Association, where she was going to live for a few weeks, maybe months, until Sheila felt it was safe to bring her to their new Sarasota home. Sheila knew separating Daryl from the rest of the family was a tough decision, but she had no idea that it would lead to disastrous and deadly consequences. It was November 7th, 1997, nearly 2 years to the day since Sheila called Carrie and they watched Dead by Sunset. 2 years to the day that Sheila made Carrie promise, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me," she said. "Promise me that you would get Ann Rule to tell my story. It would be a story about a woman who just wanted to live her own life, and the man who would never let her go." It was 4 p.m. on Friday, November 7th, another warm day in Sarasota, as 13-year-old Stevie rushed home after an exciting day at school. Stevie had been at the local junior high school for 2 months and learned that very day that a boy she liked was going to ask her out. Stevie couldn't wait to tell her mom. When she got to the front door of their rented one-story house, right away, she noticed something was immediately off. The front door was always locked. It was one of Mom's rules. But today the front door clicked open. Then she heard the sounds, the cries of all 4 of the quads. They were wild toddlers always running around and getting into things, always excited to see Stevie when she came home. But in that moment, all 4 children stood still, clustered together in the hallway. Their faces looked like they'd been crying for hours. Stevie knew her mom never let the Quads cry like that. She was always there to scoop them up and comfort them. Where was her mother? Stevie searched the house, the back patio, the pool, the bedrooms. As she walked closer to the Quads, she noticed parts of their faces and little bodies were dotted with dark flecks. And she discovered, with a horrifying agony, those flecks were dark red. They were blood. As she stepped into the kitchen, Stevie saw what she thought was a pile of laundry. Her mom was always doing laundry. She took a few more steps and realized those clothes formed a shape of a person, someone lying on the kitchen floor. The scene, too awful, too bloody, too violent for a kid like Stevie to bear. She thought maybe it was a dream. She knelt down and cautiously touched her mother, whose body was covered in blood. "Mom? Mom?" But there was no answer. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. And that's when it all became real. "My mom," she told the dispatcher, "is dead." Sheila Bellish's death was never supposed to be a mystery. It was never a whodunit. Sheila and Carrie both knew. If anything ever happened to Sheila, it was Alan. Who else but Alan? And yet when Carrie learned her sister had been murdered, she would soon learn the man who did it. It wasn't Alan Blackthorne. It couldn't have been. When authorities in Texas and Florida descended on Alan Blackthorne, assessing his role, if any, in this murder, Alan, he was nowhere near Sarasota, Florida on that day, or any day. He was in Texas, likely on a golf course. He was always on a golf course. And maybe now, with his ex-wife gone, golf would be his singular obsession. Carrie was beside herself. She knew Alan was involved. But once again, it looked like he was going to get away with it. Carrie promised she would ensure her sister got justice, and she would have Ann Rule tell her story. How long that would take, she had no idea. Time passed. 1997, 1998, 1999, Y2K, and then a new century, the year 2000. And still, Carrie had failed to do the 2 things that her sister asked her to do. Somehow her sister's killer was a free man, and Ann Rule, the writer she needed to tell her sister's story, was nowhere to be found. Carrie and her husband Rick had tried for 3 years to get in touch with Ann Rule, with no success. In January of 2000, they decided to give it one last shot. If she wasn't interested, fine. At least they tried. Ann Rule lived in Seattle, Washington. And after roughly 30 books, she had a lot of fans. And she received roughly 3,000 emails a year from people asking Ann to look into a murder case. She thought she'd seen it all. But in January of 2000, she got a request that was nothing like she'd ever seen before, and decided to face what she called an awesome project. She'd later write, "I have been given a huge responsibility by a young woman who once read my books. After so many years, this is the first time a victim has ever chosen me to tell the story of her life and death. I owe her the truth, and I owe her a voice when she no longer has one." Which was a very poetic way of saying Ann Rule was on it. She was going to tell Sheila's story, and she was going to expose Alan Blackthorne for the vicious, sadistic, psychopathic monster that he really was. And her timing was perfect. Because around 2000, authorities were finally closing in on Alan Blackthorne. Sheila's story was devastatingly tragic. Ann's book was able to at least end with justice. Alan Blackthorne was a con man. He was dastardly, conniving, cruel, twisted, any number of bad things. But what he was, more than anything, was arrogant. Alan never said no to a reporter. He gave interviews, even appeared on true crime TV shows like 48 Hours, declaring his innocence, of course, even pinning the blame on Sheila's new husband, Jamie. And he seemed to know a lot about Sheila's murder, down to the type of bloodstains found at the scene. He also had another character flaw, and this would prove a fatal one. With all the money he had, Alan was cheap. Alan didn't want to pay for a professional hitman to kill his wife. Maybe if he had, an actual professional wouldn't have made such a mess of things. Starting with a 30-year-old guy named Danny he met on the golf course. Danny was a good golfer, but his real job was as Alan's bookie. Alan had so much money he could gamble and it would never make a dent in his fortune. Danny wasn't rich. He lived in a poor section of San Antonio with his family, including his mother and grandmother. But he aspired to be just like Alan, and he'd do just about anything Alan asked him to. So when Alan offered Danny money to take care of his ex-wife Sheila, Danny wasn't sure what to do. Maybe Alan assumed because Danny was Latino and a bookie that he had some deep connection to the criminal underworld. Danny didn't, not really. Danny dreamed of opening a sports bar, and maybe there was a way that he could have the best of both worlds. That he could have Alan pay him the money to take care of Sheila, and he'd hire a guy to do it and just tell him to rough her up, maybe scare her, and that would be that. That, of course, wasn't that. Somewhere in the communication chain, the guy who ended up at Sheila's house, he'd been told Sheila was a child abuser, and maybe that's why he felt justified. In front of her children, he shot Sheila several times. And when she ran to the kitchen to grab the phone and call 911, he took a knife and finished her off. And that guy, the one that Danny found, his name was Joey Del Toro. He wasn't a professional hitman. He was a former football star from Corpus Christi, Texas, who dropped out of high school and became a personal trainer. He helped older women lose weight at fancy spas. He needed money. He wanted more, and he was willing to do what it takes to get $4,000. But he hadn't killed anyone before, and he had no clue how to go about it. and get away with it. When he checked into the Hampton Inn near Sheila's house, he used his real ID at the hotel. And when he checked out of the hotel, he left behind a .45 caliber bullet that the maid found and turned into the front desk. He also used his own car, one that was registered to his grandmother, a Mitsubishi with Texas license plates. So Joey Del Toro was Sheila's killer. They figured that out pretty quickly. But what took a long time is getting the evidence they needed to connect Alan to Danny to Joey. And Rule was right there in 2001 when Alan Blackthorne was tried and convicted in the conspiracy to murder Sheila Bellish. And he was sentenced to life without parole. Alan Blackthorne died in prison in 2014 at the age of just 59. So justice was served, and Rule wrote all about it in what would be her best-selling book called Every Breath You Take. Carrie did what she'd promised. But there was one dark detail, one loose thread. After Sheila was found murdered, everyone wondered, how did Joey Del Toro, Sheila's killer, know where she lived? They'd gone to incredible lengths to keep their address a secret. No one knew except for a small number of people, immediate family, and one or two friends. Alan must have found out and given the killer the address. But how? And this, for me, is the darkest part of the story. Alan had a secret weapon Sheila didn't know about. Their daughter, Daryl. You'll remember Daryl was living away from the family during that time, and in October, Alan got in touch with Daryl, and he told her that he couldn't wait to be with her, that he wanted to get her back, and that they were going to spend Christmas together. So could Daryl please give Daddy the address of where they all lived in Sarasota? How could he pick her up for Christmas if he didn't know where she lived? Daryl complied and gave her father the address, never in a million years thinking of what was going to happen by giving him that address. The repercussions for that young girl thinking that she was in part responsible for the murder of her own mother, and then finding out her father used her to get that information so he could kill her mother. Daryl said at one point that her father taught her how to hate. After that October phone call, Alan never spoke to Daryl ever again. And Daryl found herself with nowhere to go. And Jamie Bellish, after what Daryl had done, he said he didn't want anything to do with her, and that he and his family in New Jersey, they would raise Stevie and the Quads, but not Daryl. Her father didn't want her, so she would go into foster care, a ward of the state, at 12 years old. Which led Carrie to do something that her sister never asked for. She took Daryl in, and even though she and her husband had 4 kids and very little money, they raised Daryl as their own. And thanks to Carrie, Daryl's story was a happy one. Carrie knew that's what Sheila would have wanted, because that's what every mother wants for their little girl. A story that ends better than their own. Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back next week with an all-new true crime story. Until then, nighty-night.